Hey, my name's Chip, and I'm the pastor at Union Church. 10 years ago, I was out celebrating a friend's wedding in California. My college roommate was getting married, and it was the most California thing ever. I think they were getting married in a redwood grove. And so it's about 11 at night, Western time, after the rehearsal dinner, and we're having a late night bonfire when my phone rings. And it's my wife to be. We're getting married the very next week. And she says she's just running a half marathon that morning and she's having some pain in her leg and some shortness of breath. It's 2 in the morning her time, so I know she's feeling very nervous. But I tell her, it's probably nothing, just stress from the wedding and tired from, running 13 miles. Well, long story short, I was wrong, and thank goodness she didn't take my advice. Instead, she listened to a friend of hers who told her she should go to the hospital, which she did, and the doctors found a pulmonary embolism, a clot in her lung, which, if you know anything about pulmonary embolisms, they're life-threatening. And so she spent the week before our wedding in the hospital and only got her early release if she promised to get her blood checked on our honeymoon. And so that's what we did. We spent our honeymoon in hospitals in Virginia. But I didn't mind because my bride was alive and God had given her life, literally her second wind. And I think about that story every time I think about God's promise to give each of us our second wind through the gift of the Holy Spirit. Last week, we saw the promise of the Holy Spirit in Joel chapter 2. It's God's promise to give us a breath of fresh air through a relationship with Him. And this week, we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 2, where God fulfills His promise to give us our second wind. We could all use a second wind right about now. We're all tired. And the Holy Spirit delivers us that second wind when He redeems our life from pain and gives us opportunities to treat our neighbors differently. First, let's look at the second wind the Holy Spirit gives us from pain. Beginning to read Acts chapter 2 at verse 1. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. When the Holy Spirit arrives on Pentecost, it's a redemption from our pain. In the short term here, Jesus' followers were feeling the pain of His absence. The traditional spot where they all gathered together in verse 1 was that same upper room that Jesus appeared to the disciples after He was raised from the dead. When Jesus first came to them, they were in despair, but not anymore. After seeing Jesus alive, they aren't in despair, but they're still experiencing pain because Jesus is absent from them again. This is the immediate setting for the gift of the Holy Spirit. But there's also the larger setting, and that is that over hundreds of years of longing, they're waiting for things to be different. This is that same deep-rooted desire for change, which we see in our own time in the outpouring of anguish, Floyd's death this past week, and that despair feeling that things seem to never change. God had promised through Joel a change, but that was 800 years before, and God's people have been waiting this whole time for God to fulfill His promise. This is why the wind that blows in verse 2 at first feels violent and even dangerous like fire in verse 3. I want to speak for a minute directly to our 2020 grads here. It would be easy, given everything that you've experienced, and specifically everything that's been taken from you over the last couple months. Prom, award ceremonies, final plays, graduation. It'd be easy and even understandable, given all of that, to stop expecting good things in life. Your grief and your fear about the future, about all these changes that you weren't equipped for, and for which none of us adults have any real answers either, might rob you of that great hope of continuing to expect good things. I understand wanting to crawl into a dark corner and just despair. I feel that too. But hope, that expectation God gives us of a better future, is what is inviting you, even more than us adults, into what is going to happen next. Experience your grief and sadness, but don't become accustomed to it. The greatest loss you could actually experience is the loss of yourself. And so this is the promise of the Holy Spirit, the promise of God breathing new life into this world and giving a second wind to us, is, I believe, especially today, a promise for you. The Holy Spirit brings a second wind which redeems the painful moments of our lives. Your pain is unique, but the beauty of a new world is going to come first to you, and you will have the opportunity to grasp it before any of us do. Second, the Holy Spirit's second wind brings us all new opportunities to love our neighbors. Beginning to read from verse 5 of Acts 2. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard them speaking in his own language. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Are not all these men who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in his own native language? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues." Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, "What does this mean?" Some, however, made fun of them and said they have had too much wine. What Acts 2 describes here is the fulfillment of God's promise in Joel to pour his Spirit out on all types of people in every language and nation imaginable. God fulfills his promises, and you can trust him. After Pentecost, this is what we see God doing first locally, then regionally, then globally. This is why we as a church support the work the Doyles do through Global Gates in New York City, to reach those who have never had an opportunity to encounter a relationship with the living God. This second wind God promises to give us, which we could all use right about now, it isn't just a promise to redeem our pain, whether it's a loss of routine, financial hardship, physical pain, or the loss of a loved one. God's promises look past our pain in a way that we often can't. God also promises that our second wind will help us to bless our neighbors. The Holy Spirit is a promise to help us share good news with our neighbors in a way that not just we, but in a way that they can understand. Now, I know this may be hard for us to get behind in a time like this, but the Holy Spirit is still continuing to empower us as the church to love our neighbors. This is going to require a lot more creativity going forward, because the old ways of doing things, the door-to-door handshake strategy, just isn't going to cut it. But let me first suggest, just by being the people the Holy Spirit is making us to be, we are witnessing to our neighbors. I have been so encouraged these last couple months to see how we as a church family have come alongside one another in calls or texts or emails, small acts of kindness, random gifts dropped at each other's door. In short, what we've done is we've taken care of each other. And that's something this time has shown all of us, is how much we need other people. Collectively as the church, we witness to our beloved neighborhood by just being a community that takes care of each other. This is us being a light on the hill, and it's a good place to start. We often read this passage in Acts 2 and think, well, I don't have any grand experience of the Holy Spirit like that. My shutters haven't been rocked by a holy rolling. But let me insist instead that the Holy Spirit is with you, and that the Holy Spirit's grandest act is creating a steady, faithful church. I know one of the popular things for families to do in the first couple months of COVID was driveway mosaics. You got out some sidewalk chalk, you drew on some areas with white chalk, and then you let the kids fill it in, just like a mosaic. We as a family went over to a friend's driveway to socially distance see them, and I know a lot of these mosaics are pretty intricate and really beautiful. Come to think of it, it might be fun for us to do this as a church in the driveway. But I've been thinking also about how those mosaics are a picture of the church. Each of our small acts of faithfulness, of not trying to take care of the whole neighborhood at once, but of one neighbor right next to us. Tiny as that may be, it's just one piece of tile in the Spirit's mosaic, which the Holy Spirit is crafting into something that's grand and beautiful. So take away this assurance today, friends. God has delivered on his promise of the Holy Spirit to not only breathe new life into you, but to give you a second wind to be a blessing to your neighbors. I can't wait to see what God does through you.